So one of the things that comes to mind when talking about standards and web standards was back with Internet Explorer 6. And one thing with Internet Explorer 6 that Microsoft did is they decided on their PNG files that were transparent that they wouldn't support the transparency. So you can see something, what this would look like in Internet Explorer 6 and what this might look like in Firefox at the time, where the transparency allows that blue to come through, but on this one that white background is being applied to it. The thing about standards is browsers have to support, or basically have to say, okay, if everybody is going to do it this way, then we will support it this way. And a long time ago, we had a lot of issues where browsers wouldn't abide by those standards. Well, and if people aren't doing the same way, then as developers, we can't code and expect our results to work correctly. So there's two groups I want to talk about today. The first one is WG, okay? And that stands for the Web Hypertext Application Technology Working Group. And these guys are going to oversee different elements of technology. You can see here some of the things they look over with HTML, different compatibility, different ways things are encoded, some of the document object models, HTML, different HTML storage, stuff like that. And they're a group that definitely tries to set some of these standards up. And these guys are made up of individuals from each company that has kind of skin in the game. So Mozilla will send in a bunch of developers, Microsoft will, Google, because they have Chrome, are going to send in a bunch, and together they decide what these standards are going to look like. There's another group called the Worldwide Consortium, and this group is really the big one, who they work with the WG to create standards, but this is really the one that creates standards for how we develop online. And I've got a link here. If you go to w3.org/tr, you can look at all the different things that they've done. Again, there's 1,218 different specifications at the time of this recording, and it's going to look at everything. Maybe they're looking at new media queries, and that'll be something we learn in here, or look at different speech modules we can put into our code, and different ways we do color, and so we can look at what they're working on and these standards. And if we want to look at a standard, we can, like, let's look for, I don't know if the image standards. Okay, so CSS image modules level 3. And if we look in here, we can see different things that they're putting on the spec sheet on how we want to deal with CSS images and how they should be written out and what the syntax looks like and things like that, if it makes sense. So they do this in a series of steps, okay? It doesn't just come out and they have a standard that they apply to the whole world. And you can see here I can change the status of different ones from a working draft to a candidate recommendation, to a proposed edited recommendation, to a proposed recommendation, and then to a recommendation. And then after, it's been out a while, they can retire certain things and make, old deprecated code just not part of it. And so, if I want to look at the latest and the greatest, I can look at some different working drafts, or, some candidate recommendations that are maybe starting to come out, or recommendations that are made, things like that. One in particular I'm excited about is the CSS Grid layout module number 2. So we got CSS Grid a few years ago, and it's been made a recommendation, and it's being used out online, and we'll learn that in this class, for example, right? And so they want to make adjustments to it, and so they call this level 2. And right now, you can see that this is in a working draft. It's not being sent out to the world yet, and the browsers aren't expected to fully adopt this yet. But this is kind of how it works with these standards, right? So it's just important that we follow the standards, and we watch as new stuff's coming down the pipeline. And it comes out all the time. If we look at all of these and we look at the latest stuff, we can see that they're working on it. You know, and this one's done in April and March and February, and they're constantly updating this and making changes to it. So let's talk about accessibility first, web standards and accessibility. So there is a group that the W3 kind of oversees, and it's the Web Accessibility Initiative, or WAI is what we call this. And in here, it's a group of people that try to make sure standards are followed for those that have disabilities, right? And so there's all kinds of stuff. So let's dig into here. Let's look at designing for web accessibility, and you can see here they give a bunch of examples on, you know, dealing with contrast between foreground and background, and you can see this is a lot easier to read than this, so people that might be a little colorblind or have a hard time reading, you know, can do that. Having for example, these shapes here, having numbers associated in case somebody was colorblind, they could tell which number they're looking at if they can't see reds or greens or something like that, right? And so they give a bunch of recommendations on how to deal with this stuff. I've got some infographics here that I ran across, you know, different web accessibility notes for designers, and you can kind of see lists in here. Good contrast, use true text whenever possible, watch the use of caps, you know, adequate font size, that you don't make them too small, different things like that. And it's good to be aware of this stuff. You know, there's a lot of people that have these disabilities, you know, whether it be visual or learning disabilities or what have you. And so there's a lot of good resources. This is one here I ran across, a little infographic that talked about designing a page a little bit text-sized. You know, screen readers need to be able to read it. And we will, you know, definitely teach different aspects of that in the class as we move along, and making sure you guys are doing that correctly. You know, don't rely just on color. Provide alternatives, you know, using alt tags on images in case they can't see the image, they can hear it. And just, again, different stuff like that. Again, mostly it's because this American Disability Act that came out back in 1990, and they've made a bunch of changes to 98. I know if you're working on any government pages, this is an absolute must, and you can get your butt in big trouble if you don't follow these rules and regulations. But I think the tool you need to, I guess the approach you need to think about the most is just using what we call universal design. For example, if I was building a building and I had some stairs leading up to it, I would definitely build a ramp, right, coming into my building, because people with disabilities might use that, and being aware of that and making those accommodations are really important. And so as you design your own websites, it's just important to make sure that you're aware of those with disabilities and keeping that in consideration as you build your content and your designs.